Hello, I am Chauncey DeVega. You may recognize my voice from Ring of Fire Radio with Mike Papantonio, the BBC, Sirius XM, or the Tom Hartman Radio Show. And you may have read some of my essays at places like Salon and Alternate. I would like to thank all of you for listening to, downloading, tweeting, and sharing the eponymously named podcast known as The Chauncey DeVega Show.
And they ran a story by somebody named Chauncey DeVega.
Quote, I find black garbage pail kids, black conservatives, fascinating.
That's just unbelievable. You know,
he goes by the name of Chauncey DeVega.
You know, I've been called Uncle Tom, Oreo, sellout, shameless, but this is a new one.
Well, let's talk now to Chauncey DeVega.
As my man Chauncey DeVega of the blog We Are Respectable Negroes says,
I have author and blogger Chauncey DeVega here with us.
Hello, nice friends, fans, supporters, and listeners to the podcast known as The Chauncey DeVega Show. Stretching. You gotta stretch. Good for you. Keep your back aligned. Keep yourself in control. Got a good show in store for folk. All you nice, kind people who routinely listen to and share the eponymously named podcast known as The Chauncey DeVega Show. That's the Deflategate exhalation. You want to hear it again? Here's a third one. So Tom Brady, folks who know the podcast who listen to me here, good friends, know of my devotion to the New England Patriots, the greatest football franchises to ever play the game, bar none and period. So the NFL, which somehow can protect woman beaters, drug addicts, killers, has come to the momentous conclusion that the New England Patriots and Tom Brady supposedly deflating some footballs mandates one of the worst punishments ever meted out against an NFL franchise. I just gotta get this off my chest because it's absurd. It's a sign of the weakness of the president, that Mr. Good Old Guy running the NFL, which is a cartel, legal monopoly, that they go over the top to punish Mr. Tom Brady and two folks who are supposedly deflating footballs, while you got other teams scuffing the ball, heating the ball, piping crowd noise in, texting people on the sideline illegally. You're going to come down on one of the greatest quarterbacks of all time and suspend him for 4 games in the upcoming season. You see, number one, it's very hard for fans. This is what it means to be a fan, to suspend any sort of critical distance from that which they love. That's what part of being a fan is. Now, that having been said, having looked at the report, and I ain't going to read all 287 pages. I've listened to other folks who read the thing and highlighted it, to determine that Tom Brady, more likely than not, had some knowledge of some footballs being deflated. Talk about a low standard. More knowledge than not, or more likely than not? Come on now. No, it ain't a court of law, but give me a break. So Brady will appeal it. And I'm going to give you a little something I'm sure you have thought about too. And I never let the facts get in the way of a good conspiracy. So number one, all the teams are likely doing this. All sorts of shenanigans are going on, rumored has it, with inflating and deflating balls, 1 PSI, 2 PSI, whatever. 2, the Patriots whooped Indy's butt and they set a sting operation up for them. And never mind the fact that the Patriots destroyed Indy in the second half of the game more than they did the first half of the game when these balls were supposedly replaced. So my man, Mr. Tom Brady, I know folks are like, Chauncey, we want to hear about the guest. We want to hear about all the other information and observations you have to make about issues of public concern. But indulge a brother for a moment. Indulge me, if you would. So, Tom Brady is supposedly involved in this great conspiracy. If it is true, it's like Nixon and Watergate. You win in the election. Why the hell do you have to do it? I don't believe he knew it. I think it's a systemic problem. And I think sometimes when you're a criminal, you're guilty of being caught. And you can't use the defense while everybody else is doing it. But here's, like I said, the facts will not interfere in my analysis. Mighty funny thing, isn't it? That Brady comes off his suspension, assuming it's not argued down to 2 games, because I don't think they'll give him 2 games. Because the 4-game suspension means the Tom Brady comes back against Indianapolis in what will likely be one of the most watched regular season games in NFL history. You got so many storylines here. You've got redemption. You've got revenge. You've got the legacy. You've got, can the Patriots survive the 4 games with their backup quarterback? You've got the relationships between Kraft and Belichick and Brady. Is it on the rocks? mean, the 24/7 ESPN, talk radio, sports people are going to have a field day with this. And I don't for one moment think the NFL is going to let that moment get away from them. Money in the bank. And Brady and the Patriots being so damn good, this would be motivation for my Patriots to go back to the Super Bowl one more time and unleash hell on anybody who stands against them. I had to get that off my chest. Just had to. This whole thing is just a miscarriage of justice. A miscarriage of justice. So this great episode of the podcast series known as the Chauncey DeVega Show, really cool guest, something for the grog nerd military, ghetto nerd types, and yes, something that everybody can be curious and interested about. Remember, we're talking about social history, and sometimes you can tell a whole lot about history through an object or a weapon. Apparently, there are books written on the history of boxes. I got to read this book about the box. The history of the cubicle. Salt. There's a really cool book about ice. And this man who was known as the Ice Baron, I think in the 19th and early 20th century before refrigeration was perfected on railroads. And I think that's one of those little discussed black inventions. Every little black boy and girl probably at some point, at least the middle class, working class strivers, and some of our poor brothers and sisters as well, I am sure, they go home and at Christmas they would get that book of great Negro inventors or 100 little known black inventions. I do believe that interstate refrigeration on trains was invented by a black man, and he also helped to perfect air conditioning. I may be conflating my great black inventors and thinkers, but I do think that was one of those facts, just like the street light. Just like the respirator that racist firefighters refused to use, rumor has it, because a black man invented it. You hear that little affect there? See, that's when I do my black nationalist 5% voice. You see, being black in the West and the black Atlantic means that we wear many hats, many faces. It's double consciousness, cubed and squared and quadruple. No, it really isn't, by the way. And Du Bois's mention of double consciousness is one of the most misunderstood concepts in American letters. I mean, everybody quoted Brother Du Bois at double consciousness. They need to go read Adolph Reed's great book, Brother Du Bois. But it's so much fun to code switch, isn't it? And how many other folks, as I said, this is why I love the podcast, because we go where we may in the intro, just sharing stories. How many other black and brown folk, and maybe some white brothers on the other side of the railroad tracks who may have grown up on the chocolate side of town like Dusty Rhodes from the WWE, WWF. And if you didn't see that great E60 special on NXT and the World Wrestling Entertainment, man, you got to check it out. That's why we love wrestling. Those human stories. And for folks who are smart Marxists, nothing surprising there. But for folks who are new to wrestling or wonder why we love this thing so much, you got to check out that ESPN E60 series. Very, 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 very good stuff. I know I've had this happen to me. When you call up, when you're looking for a job, when you're at a college or high school, or even in your professional life, and you do an interview, and you're doing the first round of interviews and the second round of interviews, and they finally fly out, and they think based on your voice that you're another race. And there's only one race, the human race. But I've got so many times where I walk in a room and they're like, you're black? I guess that's because the timbre, or is it timber? Borrowing from Seinfeld, my voice would suggest something else. I mean, this is boxes and stereotypes that people construct around folk. I mean, how limiting is that cognitively? How limiting is that? So, of course, I want to do something very serious. Number one, send some love out to people in Oklahoma. Them horrible tornadoes coming through there. Please be safe. Someone who's very dear to me, her family's house got hit with a tree. And I hope her people are okay, her and her grandma. And, of course, Jim Ross, he's from Oklahoma. And a great podcast. You should listen to Jim Ross if you're into wrestling. He was up there talking about his tornado experience. I was in a tornado once, a micro tornado in my hometown. And I remember, and I think I've told the story here on the podcast before, hearing this noise, this horrible thunderstorm, the sky turned green and blue and yellow. It was just surreal. And my doggy at the time, Mr. Bandit, he was going crazy, wanting to go downstairs and running around the house. And I'm like, Bandit, calm down. So he's totally freaking out. Very, very reliable, smart dog. So, of course, he could hear what was coming. So you hear a noise, and it sounds like a person breathing. It doesn't sound like a train. It sounded like somebody moaning, like, That's my zombie voice. It's also my tornado voice. And it gets deeper and deeper. And I remember from elementary school, I had to be in like 4th grade at the time, or 5th grade. I remember you go and you open up the windows so the house doesn't implode. But then you got to be afraid of the glass. So I open up the windows a little bit because I'm hearing it. It's getting closer. It's getting closer. And the rain is sideways. There's hail. The air is really heavy. You don't hear any of the birds. It's one of the hottest days I'll ever remember. And that I've ever experienced, by the way. And I'm looking out the window and it's torrential rains and there's a black man on a bicycle trying to ride it down the hill in damn near 80, 90 mile an hour winds. I'll never forget that. And then, of course, the phone is ringing, godparents, people calling. I'm trying to hide in the basement with the dog. He's trying to run upstairs and you hear a boom, horrible noise. And this tree, huge, old, beautiful tree, fell down, crushed the neighbor's car, damn near hit my bedroom, would have killed me, crushed the house. But fate blew the tree about 10 feet the other way. So much love to those folk in Oklahoma and condolences to folks who have been lost and their families in that horrible train crash. Talk about, we need to get this infrastructure in this country fixed. We are rotten from within. That horrible train crash, D.C. to Philly, stopping in New York. I've been on that train a few times. And let me tell you, Amtrak, man, it's a wonderful ride. I love taking the train. But we have to fix this country's infrastructure. So thoughts go out to the people who suffered injuries, people who lost someone, the folks who were lost. May their souls be shepherded to wherever they call the afterlife. Hope they didn't suffer. Hope it was quick. But we got to fix this country, boy. The Japanese, the Chinese, the Europeans, we are rotten from within. And people want to maintain this narrative about American exceptionalism. We can't even get the damn trains to stop crashing. Bridges falling down. Roads broken. And here's an interesting counterfactual what if for an America that did not exist because of racism. And there's going to be a lot of histories written about the broken moment here with the election of Barack Obama and the white right and the hair and vote Republicans and these Tea Party troglodyte mouth-breathing racial chauvinists who hate that man. They just hate his guts. They hate the fact that that beautiful black man and his beautiful black wife and his beautiful black kids are in that White House. They hate it. The symbolic politics are too much for them to deal with. And hint, a great podcast coming up with a fun guest in a few weeks where we actually talk about symbolic politics and American political development and racism and the color line in Obama. That, think about this. If the Republicans actually loved America more than they hated Barack Obama, if they actually loved America more than they worship the neoliberal 1% plutocrats, if the Republicans actually loved America, so they claim, more than they love personal enrichment and aggrandizement and engaging in hateful, wicked, hostile, in many ways, and I'm using this word intentionally, I wouldn't say treasonous, but based on some of their behavior begs the question. It really does beg the question that Obama, when he was trying to right this economy a little bit, to get us out of what I think economic historians are going to basically define as a third or fourth Great Depression, maybe the third Great Depression in this country's history, the way that Bush left this country wrecked. Imagine if they had fixed some roads. Imagine if Obama was able to work with these crazy people and say, this is a great opportunity because in an economic downturn, you don't cut taxes, you spend money. You don't cut spending, you spend money. Call me a Keynesian. I'm sorry. That's how you fix things. If he had fixed them roads, if they got more people back to work, fixing the railroads, fixing the highways, fixing the infrastructure of this country, where would we be? It's a win-win for everybody involved, but they hate that black man so damn much. They hate him more than they love the country. History will not be kind to the Republican Party because, as I have said in print and elsewhere, movement conservatism and white supremacy are now one and the same thing. They are joined together. There's a moment in this very powerful movie, if you can track it down, it's a hard watch. It's called, I believe, Whore's Glory. And it's about sex workers all around the world, female sex workers. And it just blew me away, made me so sad when I saw it. There's a scene outside of a house of prostitution, I think in Thailand or India or Bangladesh. It's a sad, sad place where two dogs are having sex. 3 dogs, I think. And 2 of the dogs' penises get caught up in the female dog at the same time. It was freakish. And that's the relationship between racism and the plutocrats and the Republican Party is right now. They all stuck together. Some things just have to be said. Very excited. I'm going to do a special podcast next week, a quick drive-by, as I like to call it, with my friend Bill the Lizard about the new Mad Max movie. If they're saying it's special, boy. Folks are saying Fury Road is the real deal. George Miller did not cop out. He made the movie he wanted to make, and there's so much great stuff online about the making of this amazing movie. And when I go to a great movie, I have a routine. People know this about me. I have many vices, many weaknesses. It's part of being human, is it not? But for the special movie, for the good ones, I break out the drinking flask. I got a flask. Don't tell nobody that Chauncey DeVega has a flask. And for this movie, I'm deciding if it's going to be whiskey or vodka. It's not going to be sneaking in the Sapporo. Nah, not for this one. This is a whiskey, vodka, manly movie. I'm going to feel energized in terms of my testosterone when I leave Mad Max Fury Road. So that's my big decision. So I go to a great movie. I get the ticket ahead of time. I walk around downtown, get some candy because I ain't paying for the candy in the movie. That's overpriced. I may get some popcorn at the Walgreens, sneak that in my satchel, my little carrying sack, walk up them stairs, find a seat nice and early, and I may stop at the supermarket if they've got the fried chicken on special. And yes, I'm a black man who eats his yard bird without shame or apology. Here's an interesting factoid, going back to stereotypes, that the group that is the number one per capita consumer of watermelon are East Asians, in particular Korean American. I'll bet you too. Fried chicken's another one. Very popular with our East and South Asian brothers and sisters. I bet they are gobbling up that yard bird per capita more than any black person. Never mind that fried yard bird is a Southern food and an American food. But our Korean brothers are innovators of fried chicken. If you can get yourself some Korean fried chicken, by all means do it. So this episode of the podcast, the eponymously, I didn't let it slip, eponymously named podcast known as the Chauncey DeVega Show. Great guest, a lot of fun. Bob Neer is author of the great book, Napalm, an American Biography. And he and I, is again, going back to objects, social history, we have a wonderful conversation, sort of thinking about that horrific weapon. How did it come into being? What did the scientists and engineers who created that horrific device, and napalm, as you've seen in many movies, we talk about that, sort of the iconography, the iconic images of napalm in Vietnam and that poor burned little child. All these images of these burning agents, and how they're seared quite literally into America's imagination, how America is perceived abroad, and how it's related to American power. What did those scientists and engineers think about inventing such a device? This is about philosophy of science and morality and responsibility. So we touch on that. And then we sort of, we have that fun sort of drive where our conversation is focused. So if you're interested in the technology, you're going to learn a lot. But it's also about issues of power and human rights. And Bob makes a great observation. He says Americans love weapons at work. And then they can link it in their imagination to a battle or a war that they won. Because I asked him about drones and how drones are shaping America's perception abroad. And he very insightfully observed, he said, well, once we see the long view, and if America uses drones and there's blowback or we lose a war with drones, then that technology will be tainted by association. So great conversation with Bob Neer. Really, really, really smart, on point, insightful. And as I said, I'm always struggling and working hard to bring you good, smart, interesting people doing interesting and smart things, as is our tagline here on the Chauncey DeVega Show. And because of your support, because of folks emailing folks who email folks who email folks, I get these great emails. How many emails is that for? Email to email to email to email, saying, hey, we'd like to sit down and chat. Hey, what are you doing next week? Let's build. Hey, I got a new book. You want to talk about it? And these are just wonderful and great opportunities to provide something educational and interesting and exciting to all of you. Other random thoughts, too. You notice this week on the website, I just did so much writing these last 2 weeks. A lot of original material. I've been trying to share some different things. Some great pieces on ChaunceyDeVega.com I shared from Der Spiegel. One is about the real history of ISIS. And of course, we have to have our obligatory observation about Seymour Hersh's claims about Osama bin Laden actually being killed. I guess he was in his bed getting dialysis and he was given up by the Pakistanis, and SEAL Team 6 went in there and destroyed him and threw out his body parts over the helicopter as it flew over the ocean. That Seymour Hersh story, that's all over the media. Democracy Now! Gave him about 45 minutes to talk about it. As I said on ChaunceyDeVega.com, I've said elsewhere, other folks, we talk about conspiracy theories. A conspiracy simply means more than one person is involved. You don't have to be paranoid. You don't have to be crazy to actually be right in terms of paranoia. There could be somebody actually after you. But I always thought the official line, given what we know about the relationship between myth-making, propaganda, Hollywood, and the Pentagon, was all so much BS. I've always felt. And read the article. I'm going to give it away. I think Seymour Hersh is onto something. I think he's more wrong than right about some details because some stuff just doesn't add up. But the idea that Osama bin Laden will be in the heart of the Pakistani military and security apparatus, sitting there right near their West Point, right near a military base, right near their CIA or one of their outlets there, and no one knows that man is there. Give me a break. He got given up. And it was a hit job, and that man was laying in bed and they killed him and they took him out. And as I said, as they should have. But again, maybe in 50 years, the truth will come out. But the reaction to Seymour Hersh's piece in many ways is more interesting than the claims that he actually advances. So do check that out. A lot of wonderful and good reporting. Here's another little lead. I may put it up next week or over the weekend, ChaunceyDeVega.com. Boing, boing. Did I pronounce that right? boingboing.net, Boing. Really fun tech website. They've given me some love with some links on some pieces I've done. They have a really neat piece about the history of role-playing games and the company that actually, I think they produced Shadowrun. They produced some of the early cyberpunk style role-playing games back in the day, and how the FBI was investigating them because they felt like they were giving information to hackers. Track that story down. I think it was, TSR Games, or, I'm getting the technical stuff wrong, but it's on Boing Boing on the front page. Or go to the Google friend, the internet machine, and type in Boing Boing role-playing games FBI investigation. And you may learn something before you're done. So, without further ado, great guest, Bob Neer, Napalm, and American Biography. I know you're going to enjoy this conversation. And as always, if you like our conversations here on the podcast, the eponymous name podcast on the Chauncey DeVega Show, please download, tweet, share, and subscribe. iTunes is very, very helpful because that gets us more eyes on the project. Stitcher is cool. You can bring it with you on your smartphone or other device. And tell your friends. Tell your friends at Chauncey DeVega. We got some great content. A lot of wonderful sharing. So many guests lined up, already recorded, because as you know, my policy is record it and put it away. Always try to be ahead of the game. But I got so many great folks, such as Bob Neer coming up, such as last week's guest, Joe McKinney, where we talked about all things zombies. And as I said, that's that fun connective tissue here for zombie aficionados and folks who are interested in military affairs. Hey, fire is a weapon. Worked in World War Z. Great book, horrible movie. So Bob Neer is our guest here on the Chauncey DeVega Show. On the website, we have a series called Ghetto Nerds, and under that, we talk about military affairs. But an obvious question, why a book on napalm?
Well, there were several reasons, really. First of all, I was getting my PhD at Columbia, and I needed a dissertation topic. One reason to write the book on napalm was because it was an interesting historical topic, a weapon that had affected millions and millions of people, but that the best publicly available historical information about it was Wikipedia. Nobody had written a book or even an academic journal article about napalm ever. When you're looking for a dissertation topic, if you can find something that nobody has talked about and that's important, that's a good opening. So that was the first reason. The second reason really was that in more general terms, in my research and in my academic career, I've been very interested in the impact of the United States on other countries around the world. You could call it America in the world, perhaps, is the shorthand. And in particular, the effect of U.S. military power. In between going to law school and then coming back to Columbia to finish my PhD, I spent 14 years running my own businesses, mostly in Asia, in Singapore and Hong Kong, also in London and Los Angeles. And living outside the country for a very long time, I became very familiar and aware of the power of the U.S. military and its impact on many people in many parts of the world. And so I wanted to try to describe in some way the evolution of the U.S. in the world, and at the same time, its military power. And so napalm was really just a vehicle for doing that. It's just one aspect of that larger story.
Why was there a cultural taboo or sort of a research taboo? Because one would think about napalm in terms of sort of, we'll talk about this, the sort of the cultural iconography and popular culture, the way that, as you said, abroad, it's associated with American empire and power, napalm and its association with the Vietnam War. And was it just a taboo that, it's such a horrific weapon that researchers had sort of stayed away from it, and the military-industrial complex was really sort of non-cooperative in providing resources? Or is it just something practical that no one had thought to write about something so ubiquitous?
To take the practicalities first, there's no prohibition or even difficulty about writing napalm. I mean, a book or even any kind of other research that you wanted to do about that weapon. It's not secret. The government allowed its inventors to publish a patent about the chemical composition of the incendiary a few years after the end of World War II. So in contrast to things like, let's say, nuclear weapons, where there are lots of secrecies and rules that restrict access to information about them, in the case of napalm, it was publicly available for the whole world to see from the 1950s on. I didn't have to use any secret documents or file any Freedom of Information Act requests to write my book. Everything that was in that book was just in plain sight, waiting for somebody to take a look at it. So I think a bigger question is why nobody wrote about it. Could be in a more philosophical sense that in general, I would say that American research academics have turned away from examining military questions in the last 20 years or so, or maybe even more, since the Vietnam War, perhaps one might say. So that whereas in the old days, back 40 years ago or 50 years ago or 100 years ago, there were quite a lot of people doing research on military topics and military subjects in one kind or another. These days, that's really relatively rare, especially at Ivy League institutions and other of the largest research universities. So you can say that interests have gone in other areas. And I think that perhaps the word taboo is an appropriate one to use. You might conclude that people were perhaps ashamed or embarrassed or not eager at any rate to discuss this particular incendiary weapon. But I think that that's not of the three subjects that I just discussed. I think that's probably the least convincing because exactly as you mentioned, napalm has been talked about in the broadest sense in popular culture extensively. There are also many other unpleasant things that people are quite willing to talk about, for example, atomic weapons, but many other things also, and are subjects of research that yield hundreds or thousands of books and periodicals and have done so over the last few decades. So my best answer is really that turning away from examination of military and military related problems by elite American research universities.
Is it a problem of funding, or is it, thinking about the folks who do IR, is it just more sexy to talk about, high concepts like, realism versus constructivism, or to talk about globalization and American ideas as a way of maintaining empire, as opposed to the nitty-gritty of weapons that are used to maintain and enforce empire? Or is it funding? It's like, hey, the big foundations and departments are like, you know what? We're not really interested in funding that type of research because it's not sexy.
Actually, it is sexy to use that term insofar as what you mean by that is that it has popular appeal. Exactly as you had mentioned, popular culture, let's say movies, to some degree books, journalism, are well aware of the sexiness of topics related to war, death, you might say, military topics in general. There are heaps and heaps of movies that continue to be produced about war in one aspect or another. Fury, just coming out now with Brad Pitt, all the way to classic movies like Saving Private Ryan and so on. So what I perceive is more, as opposed to a lack of sexiness, a turning away is the term that I had used on the part of research academies from these types of subjects. And why that should be, I really don't know. I can maybe guess, but it wouldn't be any real sort of informed guess. But I think that the trend is easily observed. None of the major research universities conduct anywhere near the examination of the U.S. military or national security state with any kind of comparable focus to that which they devote to, let's say, race relations, gender relations, political representation of various kinds, cultural histories, and other subjects, which are also very important and interesting to me anyway.
Related conversation about the corporatization of the university, neoliberalism, as you said, the deep state, and how so many Americans really have, number one, no understanding about how power really works and is configured institutionally in the country. And it's really sort of challenging and frustrating from my point of view that you really don't have these opportunities for, I always get my Greek wrong here, and you can help me, parrhesia, sort of that opportunity for truth-telling on a whole range of subjects related to American foreign policy, because quite literally, number one, it's impolitic. You can get in big trouble. You may not get tenure. And it may attract the sort of public attention that the institutions that you work for may not like. So it really is sort of challenging and frustrating when you think about the role of the university in terms of creating citizens and the types of conversations that are not happening in many of our schools right now. But I was thinking, you mentioned earlier about your travels across Asia as a businessman. How is napalm viewed around the world? Is it really, now we're in the era of the drone. McDonald's has conquered the world and Hollywood has conquered the world. But how do folks in other parts of the world look at napalm as it relates to a symbol of American power?
My argument in the book, and I continue to think this, is that napalm is perceived as a very American weapon. As a factual matter, it was invented by the United States. It was used first by the United States in war. It's been used more extensively, more widely, and over a longer period of time by the United States than by any other country. So, although in fact napalm has been used by almost every major military power in almost every major military conflict since its invention, it still retains a very strong popular association in this country, but also even perhaps more globally with the United States as an American weapon. Perhaps you might say comparable to atomic weapons, although those weapons are now so widely distributed and their threat is so great that people don't, I think, quite as strongly associate them with the United States. But that's just an impressionistic reaction.
Is napalm looked at as sort of the symbol of, again, looking at it from abroad, of American bullying or American innovation, or just a symbol of terror? Because as you wisely pointed out and smartly pointed out in the book, I mean, going all the way back to Greek fire, all right? Fire has been used as a weapon. Napalm is basically, and again, correct me, any gelatinized incendiary.
Yeah, the term napalm just means any kind of thickened petrochemical. So it can be any kind of chemicals, and they could be mixed with, let's say, kerosene or other types of oil or gasoline or petrochemical derivatives. It doesn't have any specific chemical composition or meaning. And so that's why it's easy to make, and that's why many different kinds of napalms are possessed by many different militaries around the world. With respect to its metaphorical meaning, it seems to me that it is a metaphor for the trajectory of American power since World War II, when at the end of World War II, napalm was a hero, and it was perceived as having to help defeat these monstrous regimes in Germany and Japan, which in the eyes of much of the world had started the war and had been responsible for some of its worst horrors. So at that time, napalm was part of a global effort to win tragic and terrible war. In the case of American popular opinion, napalm wasn't really considered to be a monstrosity, a kind of synonym for barbarism that it later became, until it lost in the Vietnam War, and was kind of made until America lost in the Vietnam War, and napalm, which had been heavily used there, became a kind of scapegoat, let's say, for that defeat. So the ultimate sin of napalm was losing. And I think that to apply that lesson to more contemporary events, it suggests that drones, while they may be criticized and may have various objectionable aspects to them, will be judged heroes or villains mostly on their effectiveness in the battle. So if the United States is perceived to have been victorious in its current conflicts that it's using drones in, then they'll be great, more or less. Although some people may consider them to be problematic, but in general, popular opinion will celebrate them. Whereas if a whole series of subsequent military disasters occur, then people may conclude that drones helped to precipitate a problem and didn't really effectively solve it, and they'll be reviled the way that napalm is now.
I mean, that's just a great connection, and I love playing with the counterfactual. I'm thinking through a puzzle here. So Americans love drones, just like, I would say perhaps it's a function of American exceptionalism. Perhaps every society loves a weapon that they can use against others, which to this point has little consequence for them directly, in the sense that no one is, using drones against them. So we love having scythed chariots until someone else shows up with scythed chariots and starts cutting our soldiers' legs off. So do you think that the attitudes about drones and napalm would change if those weapon systems were used against American soldiers? Because according, just sort of thinking about my own reading as a hobbyist, more than interested observer over the years, I believe the last time American soldiers were subjected to air attack was in the later part of World War II. So do you think the attitudes around napalm and drones would be different if there were images or experiences of Americans being attacked by napalm, or inevitably, because it's off-the-shelf technology at this point, when American soldiers are attacked by drones?
Well, first of all, I'm not sure that I would agree that Americans love drones. I think that opinions are evolving on those weapons. They are perceived to be very effective by some and problematic by others, and are still so new, and their role has been so relatively marginal that I don't think that most people have a strong opinion one way or another, compared to, let's say, weapons like napalm, atomic bombs, or things that are, very well known and have been used, or at least potentially used, for decades. But anyway, in terms of the weapons being used against Americans, there are instances in which napalm has been used against the U.S.
Well, I was thinking the USS Liberty attack would be one.
Mm-hmm. The U.S. Liberty attack is one, but also there are other accidents. That attack was judged by official inquiries to have been an accident. There are other accidents by the U.S. forces themselves or ourselves against U.S. troops. For example, in the movie We Were Soldiers by Mel Gibson, which is based on a book by the same name, there is a very vivid depiction of an accidental napalm strike on U.S. troops in Vietnam during the Valley of the Ia Drang battle. And the images are absolutely horrific. Again, I don't think that popular opinion about weapons is formed decisively by such small incidents or individual incidents, which are enormous for the people involved, but in the context of a larger struggle are not perceived as significant. What is significant are broad perceptions of military defeat, the way that the Vietnam War is perceived to have been lost by the United States, or broad perceptions of military success, like the way that World War II is perceived to have been a victory. So I think that kind of cataclysmic effect is what is likely to be determinative, as opposed to instances, individual, even though they may be considerable, of weapons being used against Americans. To take the case of airplanes, which you mentioned, those are a kind of technology that was in large part invented by the United States and is also very closely associated with the United States, like the Wright brothers and Kitty Hawk and all that. But people don't blame airplanes for the fact that they caused Pearl Harbor or that U.S. troops were attacked by them. That's the determining factor, is the ultimate effectiveness of the weapon, not its individual incidental use.
You're smartly pointing out, the cultural narratives that can be spun in the context of victory or defeat, depending on how you frame it. But it's funny you mentioned aircraft, because I was thinking about, 2 points. One is, the great documentary Why We Fight. And there's a scene in Why We Fight, and if folks haven't seen it, by all means they should. It begins, with Eisenhower's iconic speech about the military-industrial complex, and then starts to work through American public opinion, and then 9/11 and the spin around the Iraq War, or disinformation, depending on how you want to present it. And there's a scene where there's a woman who's a refugee from Vietnam, and she is now an engineer who works on, she puts it, designing penetrating devices, aerial penetrating bombs, missiles, and so on, and she's working on the Moab. And she has a sort of odd sort of affect or even affection for the device. And I'm wondering, in your research about napalm, how did the inventors of napalm who actually got the patent, were they as fascinated and fawning and just worshipful of their invention as this young woman is? She's that young, meaning in the sense in her mid-40s, of her relationship to designing bombs and other weapons?
Yeah, that is an excellent film. A course that I taught at Columbia about the global history of the U.S. military, I would assign that film by Jarecki. And I'm familiar with the scene that you're mentioning. It's interesting that you use the word religious or affection. It seemed to me, watching that woman in that film clip, that her interest in the weapon was closer to the interest of the people who invented napalm. And that is to say, largely, maybe even exclusively, technical and focused on the craft of constructing a useful tool. Now, the use that those tools are being put to may be horrific in some senses or heroic in others. But for the people who make the weapon, at least napalm, the one that I'm familiar with, for the people who invented it and devised the really ingenious systems for igniting it, because napalm itself is not tremendously flammable. The insertion of a white phosphorus burster tube with high explosive inside that is what actually produces the fire cloud in the napalm bombs that were invented at Harvard University in the 1940s. Their whole approach was, in the broad context, the country is at war. In the medium context, we need to be patriotic participants in this collective national effort. And in the specific context, here is the most effective incendiary device that we can produce, which was our assignment. Professor Louis Fieser, who's the guy who invented napalm, said that subsequent uses of it really certainly weren't something that they considered at the time, but also were not his responsibility. So what he said to the New York Times was that he didn't know that napalm would be used, he was talking about the Vietnam War, to burn babies and Buddhists, quote unquote, and that anyway, somebody who makes a device doesn't have responsibility for how it's used. He said that people who make rifles weren't responsible for the fact that they were used to assassinate President Kennedy. That's his position. And that, I think, was the predominant position for the people who were involved in the invention and development of napalm.
I mean, is that just sort of the critical distance, the box we have to put ourselves in if you're an inventor or an engineer? In some of my classes, I have students who are aeronautical engineers and inevitably will be going to work for Lockheed Martin or working for the Pentagon directly. And these questions come up, and I always try to challenge them in terms of thinking about the philosophy and morality of science. Just because you can do a thing, should you do a thing? And do you have any culpability for its use? And it's interesting that almost to the one, they all say that it's just a device. And I'm interested in solving a problem of engineering, and how other people use it, well, that's up to them. And of course, we had some really interesting dialogues back and forth. But I was thinking too about, the inventor of the AK-47, Kalashnikov. And how he went back and forth. The New York Times, you had an interview with the Washington Post right before he died. So he's vacillated back and forth toward, from guilt to pride. And I'm sure, the political context of the Soviet Union and the consequences for his speech are certainly part of it. C.J. Shivers, his great book, The Gun, is a fascinating history of the AK-47 and the politics of its invention. Or even thinking about, Maxim, the inventor of the Maxim machine gun, or even Gatling. He invents the Gatling gun, and there's a great biography about Gatling that just came out. And he basically thought he'd make a weapon that would make war obsolete because it's so damn horrible and efficient. And lo and behold, it makes war even more efficient. So there are these amazing paradoxes. Were there any inventors, number one, who had any sort of guilt surrounding napalm or folks who were associated with it? And do you think that's just a function of training and the way that engineers approach problems, that they wouldn't think about consequences?
These are fascinating issues, exactly as you say. First of all, with respect to the books, I have all those books that you were mentioning, and I recommend them too. The Gun by C.J. Shivers, the New York Times war correspondent, is excellent.
He's a hell of a writer too.
Yeah,
he's masterful.
Very accommodating individual too. I've had correspondence with him, and very helpful and thoughtful person. Maybe you were thinking of Mr. Gatling's Terrible Marvel, which is a book about the Gatling gun.
And that's the one, yep.
And in fact, one of the books, or a book that inspired me or helped me think about writing the book about napalm, is a book called The Social History of the Machine Gun, that you might like, or your listeners might like, by an author named John Ellis, who also has written a bunch of very interesting books about military power, including Knee Deep in Hell, which is about trench warfare in World War I, and Brute Force, which is about the Allied victory in World War II, and how many more machines the Allies made than the Axis powers had.
Oh, wow. Wonderful recommendations.
I had exactly the same kind of questions that occurred to me while I was writing the book about napalm. At first, and sometimes when I would be reading things, which, as you can imagine, there were some dark moments during the research for the book. I sometimes would think that napalm was evil. I thought of it like the scene in Cujo by Stephen King. I don't know if you've read that book, where the dog goes into this kind of hole that kind of has evil in it and takes evil into him, in Stephen King's imagination. So I sort of thought napalm was like that, or maybe like Pandora's box, something where you would open and there would be terrible things inside that people never should.
Or a type of technological fetishism or determinism, or the tree in Empire Strikes Back on Dagobah, under which the Dark Jedi is hidden and Luke is tempted.
So my resolution of that came during a conversation that I had with Kim Phuc. She's the little girl in the famous picture who was hit by napalm when she was 9 years old, as a civilian, just trying to stay away from the fighting in Vietnam. And then the Associated Press photographer Nick Ut took a picture of that, which won the Pulitzer Prize, and became an iconic picture of warfare, they called the terror of war, of the Kim Phuc burned naked by napalm running down the road, terrified, with members of her family around her. So I asked her that question, do you think that napalm is evil? And she said no. She said that napalm is just a thing. It's like a knife. She said a knife can be used for terrible, awful, evil things, if people use it, malevolently. But knives are also wonderful and useful and not in themselves the problem. So my ultimate conclusion on that question was that Kinfolk knows a lot more about it than me, having been horrifically burned at the age of 9 when, as she herself says, and everybody would agree, was completely innocent. And so if that's her attitude, then that's good enough for me, which is to say that the ultimate responsibility for good and evil lies in how people use things, and we shouldn't, let's say, abdicate responsibility by saying, well, this is just an evil thing and we can't do anything about it. It really depends on how we control things. You might look to the great philosophical movie Terminator 2. If you'll recall, motto of the movie is, we have no fate but what we make. So that's kind of my philosophy.
I was thinking too about Terminator 2. Actually, I've written an article about it, thinking about representations of African Americans in, apocalyptic and dystopian films. And the running joke for me is, a black man destroys the world. Poor Dr. Dyson. Brother can't get a break. And he finds, it's just a wonderful film. So much has been written about Terminator and the time travel paradox and technological responsibility for the philosophy and morality of science. And never mind, as a child of the 70s and 80s, the hip hop generation, I had many a nightmare about Skynet coming online and the singularity becoming real. And to now be alive, to actually see some of that technology maturing is actually just chilling in a lot of ways. Frightening beyond belief if we try to meditate on it too much. But you mentioned the young woman who's actually, the iconic photo of Vietnam. The U.S. had already lost the war. Public opinion had now turned. What was her energy like? Was she just sort of a Zen person who lived through this horrific experience? And you said, to be that profound, to say, it's just like a knife. It's just, my experience was horrific, but I'm going to maintain this sort of critical distance. What was it like to actually talk to her?
So first of all, let me just say an interesting thing that I learned. I suppose it was just like many of the things with this story, staring one in the face in plain sight. But I was not aware of the fact that photograph was actually taken in 1972. And what's interesting about 1972, among many other things, is that that's when the U.S. was really starting to withdraw from Vietnam in large numbers. And there actually are lots of pictures of children burned by napalm, really devastating images. And so the question, naturally arises is, why that photograph? Some people say, well, it's just this awesome, incredible photograph. But I don't really find that to be so convincing. I think that the photograph is quite dramatic, but also the historical context and the time in which it was taken was quite important. And so with respect to the specific history of napalm, there was a large and very active and voluble movement of protest against napalm that described it as horrific and, everything that is represented by that photograph. But that was in the late 1960s, organized against Dow Chemical Corporation, the manufacturer of napalm. And then when Dow Chemical stopped making napalm, that movement largely stopped, the protest movement on college campuses, and objections to napalm became sort of subsumed within the larger anti-war movement. In other words, it wasn't really until Americans were cognizant that the war was a disaster and that they were going to lose this, incredibly expensive, costly in terms of people's lives and also in terms of money effort, that the image of person hurt by napalm, American napalm, dropped by South Vietnamese planes, but American, became iconic. And so to me, that's quite significant, because it shows how images and representations convey larger truths, but don't carry the weight directly, specifically on that particular photograph, if you see what I mean. Dramatic though it is. With respect to Kinfolk herself, what she says, this is at the very end of the book. I talk a little bit about this. I basically just let her talk to finish the book. And so what she said is that for a long time after her injury, she was furious. She burned with a kind of napalm inside her, she says. Hatred for the people who had done this to her, jealousy of people who were not disfigured, fear for her own future. And then after about 10 years, I think, or so of that kind of rage, she discovered Christ. God, became very devoutly religious, and through that experience, she says, had the courage or the ability to forgive the people that had done this to her. When she forgave them, or as she forgave them, because as she describes it, it was a continuing process. She found herself kind of mentally healing. She still says that she suffers pain every day from this injury. she was able to become happy in a way that she hadn't previously expected was possible, to count her blessings, let's say. That's kind of the place that she is now. She got married. She has 2 children. She lives in Canada, where she defected to from Vietnam as a political refugee. And she is a UNESCO ambassador and runs a foundation to aid child victims of war.
Wow. I mean, to take that suffering and to turn it into a life of service. I mean, there are these accounts, you're talking about dark places, of torturers. You know, they have the Truth and Reconciliation Committees, and the commissions rather. And I'm always surprised by folks who are the victims of torture, how so few of them seem to be angry at the torturers. They want, justice, the ones who survived. One of the narratives I've encountered repeatedly in reading that literature is that the pity they have for the person doing the torturing and this odd intimacy that they have with one another. I mean, it's just the human spirit is just so amazing in our ability, number one, to adapt and to achieve and hopefully to overcome. But thinking about napalm and the Vietnam War, that was also one of the few weapons that the public, right, and the students in this case, in the anti-war movement, have actually succeeded in eventually having it, quote unquote, banned. We'll put that in quotation marks, right, because it's all context dependent. How did that come about?
I think with respect to your broader conclusion that I agree with you. Napalm is regulated now since 1980 under a UN Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons, which regulates sort of a kind of monsters gallery of particularly awful conventional weapons that people have devised. But it's even more strongly regulated, I would say, by public opinion, which is to say that if Assad or somebody in Syria uses napalm, the political consequences of that decision are so much greater than whatever possible military utility they could get from it, that they just don't do it. So even though napalm is quite easy to make, even though it's not secret how to make it, and there are various ways of making different kinds of napalms, its actual use is now quite rare since Vietnam, whereas prior to that, it was very frequent. And when it is used, people don't want to talk about it. So, for example, the United States used napalm to destroy some Iraqi military objectives during the invasion of Iraq. And then even though everybody could see what they were doing and knew what the weapon was, although they may not have known the definition, since, as I said, there were no histories of this weapon until the book that I wrote. Anyway, the military could deny or did deny that it used napalm, which is really totally absurd in a certain sense, because nobody denies that they use bullets or bombs. And
this is a technical question. Do fuel air explosives and thermobaric devices, do they count, quote unquote, as napalm?
Often no, because they're not based on petrochemicals. They use other kinds of substances to ignite. So that there are some that are not napalm, but fire bombs are almost uniformly napalm, and those are what were being used in Iraq.
I mean, I was thinking, it almost feels a little dirty. Just think about the listeners, right? You're hearing 2 folks talk about the technical differences between the weapons that incinerate you to death, but those distinctions are really important. Obviously, you're dead. In terms of, as you said, thinking about the cultural history and the law and the practices around it, and the way that that technical minutia can allow for certain weapons to actually be used and to be legitimated within the public imagination. I'm so glad that you mentioned Iraq, because we have a few incidents in Iraq. Number one, we have the big conversation or problem with depleted uranium and all the birth defects, never mind, with the Iraqis and others who have been targets of these weapons, but also U.S. soldiers who have been exposed to it. And Vice just had a documentary about Fallujah and the outcomes with depleted uranium. And then you have weapons, the DIME weapons, D-I-M-E weapons that have been used by the Israelis and others, and the health consequences there. But with Fallujah, there's a very famous incident, and I'm sure you've written about it and reflected about it. It was the quote-unquote shake and bake operation in Fallujah, where they use white phosphorus, which is a burning agent, which is horrific. And then you use that, and then folks come out to get cover, and then you hit them with high explosive artillery and mortars and so on. So do you think these distinctions, how do you parse those distinctions in your own mind? And do you think that the public would have more of an outcry if they actually knew what thermobaric weapons did in terms of heat, fire, and sucking people's lungs out of their bodies?
No, I think that what constitutes a weapon that's very problematic as opposed to one that's not is, as I mentioned before, its military effectiveness. So that's why, even though the devastating effects of napalm were publicized in World War II, it was still considered hero. Now, it is certainly true that the amount of information available changed in the case of napalm during the Vietnam War. And so I think that what you say has an element of truth. Certainly, the publication of photographs of people injured by napalm made a big difference in the way that people perceived the weapon. And the student-led campaign that we were talking about before, which is the small group of people initially at Stanford in Northern California and later across the country, who used napalm as a symbol of everything that was wrong with the Vietnam War, had an enormous impact on defining this weapon as monstrous, was the word that I used before. But I think that if the outcome, the history suggests that if the outcome in Vietnam had been closer to the outcome in Korea and the outcome in World War II, that objections to the weapon would be far less than the perception that napalm, as for example shown in Apocalypse Now and other movies, was barbaric and also ineffective and also part of a war that was lost. And so that's why I say that the jury is still out on the conclusions that people would draw with respect to weapons like drones. You mentioned depleted uranium. If victory is obtained in these conflicts, they may be perceived quite favorably. But at the moment, given that the United States is losing its wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, at least by its own definitions of success, the current might be running the other way.
And as we wind down, I just want to offer up a quick question and also a broad one. So one very focused and one a wee bit more broad. So do you think there's any, traction to the observation that the way that weapons are received is also a function of who they're being used against? Because I was thinking about some of what I've read about the development, I think it may have been in the book on Gatling or may have been in a journal somewhere, about the development of machine guns. And when machine guns were used by Americans and Europeans to police their colonial empires against, black, brown, and quote-unquote yellow folk, that the narrative was very different. It was a weapon of civilization that allowed the West and America to impose its will on quote-unquote savages. But then when machine guns were used as, reapers of sorrow, killing, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of white Europeans and others, that the discourse around the weapon system changed. Do you think that's a fair observation, or is that a misreading of the historiography?
I think that that's fair and well said as far as it goes, but you could perhaps go further. So the message of the book that I had mentioned before, The Social History of the Machine Gun, was in part exactly as you say. The weapon was very effective and kind of great, let's say, in the minds of English people when it was being used to help advance the British Empire and kill many, many people in other parts of the world, usually black, brown, and yellow people. And then not so great when it was used to wipe out an entire generation, people in England and France and Germany and other countries in Europe. The broader point is that beyond even that specifically cultural conclusion, there is the more general conclusion of the relationship between people, whatever color they may be, and the technology in general. And so the most useful conclusion, I think, is to draw the broadest consequence of these weapons, which is that they kill all kinds of people, and all people bleed the same color, which is red.
That's right.
So that's why I think it's useful to examine some of these historical past experiences. The conclusion is certainly useful with respect to the racism and the different kinds of cultural myopias that affect these weapons, but also in the broadest sense that the people that lay dead on the plains of South Africa were just as dead as the people that lay dead in the plains of Belgium. And so we want to try to make sure that we avoid that consequence for ourselves and our children and the people these days.
I mean, the connective tissue there between our humanity, and to borrow from Cornel West, who probably took it from somebody else, we're all born between urine and feces. That's how we enter the world, and that's how we leave it, birth and death. But the broader question, as I said, as we wrap things up, you've been so generous with your time, and I greatly appreciate it, is you've written a book about a cultural and social and political history of an object, in this case, napalm. And we have, many examples of books that use a cultural object. It could be sugar. There's a way of looking at American empire and global empire and the transatlantic slave trade and so on, and the rise of the middle class and consumerism. Other books about, a recent book I want to read about the history of the cubicle. We have histories of elevators, utensils, food. We can go down the list. What are some of the challenges and also some of the opportunities and pitfalls to be avoided in using an object as a way of thinking about broader cultural and social issues?
I wrote about it because I really am intrigued by the relationship of people and things, the environment around us. It's tempting to think that we're the masters of our own destinies and we make all of our decisions based on what is particularly best at that moment. But of course, when you look at it from a broader perspective, the power of things and the environment becomes, enormous in the context. So that was why I was attracted to that type of storytelling. And as you mentioned, there are intriguing books about, salt and cod and things like that I had read. The one that I had mentioned while you were talking there was a book called The Box, which is about the history of containers, which is also good. But
and when did that come out? Is that a recent book?
I think about 15 years ago or 12 years ago, something like that.
And it's called The Box?
Yeah, it's by a former or a writer for The Economist magazine. That can be a very appealing way to frame a question. And I think it can be, very useful as one tool among others. I just don't think, having produced the book, that it should be judged as kind of universally definitive any more than a history of cod is universally definitive of all fish, or a history of salt is universally determinative of all spices. There are books about colors and all kinds of things like that. But I do think that to the degree that they are entertaining and that they hold people's interest, that they are a good type of vehicle to use to tell stories. A great handicap of the humanities in general, or in research universities in the United States in particular, is that too often the fascinating research and interesting questions that people consider are not packaged in a way that's of general interest or has a strong story to tell, as significant and as important as those subjects may be. And so to me, the value of a vehicle like that is the way that it can help to make sense of a broader story, as opposed to, let's say, its definitive answer to a larger question. I
mean, that's just a wonderful, wonderful and incisive way of summing up, the allure of objects. As I said, there's a whole scholarship and a whole literature. As you said, they're, for the most part, the best are eminently readable. And it's something that individuals can connect to, right? Who hasn't seen a box? Who doesn't know about napalm? Who hasn't held a fork in their hand? So, I mean, there are so many resources. I mean, as I said, the readability and the way that you can try to take expert knowledge as a scholar, and then the best folks, and then take that expert knowledge and come up with something readable about social forces and ideas that the lay public may not have actually considered on the day to day. But Bob, where can folks find you online? Future projects to share? And if they want to learn more about your book, where should they go?
Well, first of all, about the book, I made a website called napalmbiography.com. And that has lots of pictures on it. It has all of the footnotes for the book, extended footnotes for the book. I had more footnotes than Harvard University Press could fit into one book. So there are places in the book where there's a little dagger in the footnotes, and then you can go to the website to find many more footnotes. And that's been useful for some people. I also put a lot of, publicly available, public domain, not secret documents online there, that people can read and look at. Some of them were kind of hard to track down. And so maybe by having them there in one place, it will be easier for people. And reviews of the book and things, because one of my great ambitions is that other people will be interested in other aspects of napalm. So for example, you mentioned racism and ways that people use weapons among different countries, which I think is really important and an important, useful subject for people to look at. That would be another good book to write, or subject to discuss in the context of napalm or other weapons. Also, one reviewer, a guy named Nick Terse, is also a friend of mine and reviewed the book for the San Francisco Chronicle, criticized it, I thought appropriately, for not having more, interviews and discussions with people who had direct firsthand experiences with napalm themselves. Kinfolk was one person that I did manage to get, but there are lots of others. And so that would be another interesting and useful follow-on subject for this subject. And there are many more. Maybe by going to that website, people can find other ideas and subjects for research. And then for my personal website, that's just at bobneer.com. There's information there about some of the courses that I've taught, the current project that I have, which is writing a book about the philosophy class that I was teaching at Columbia. And I'll post other things there as they go along.
Well, Bob, I just want to thank you again on behalf of the listeners and fans of the Chauncey DeVega Show on the website, chaunceyDeVega.com. I mean, you're so generous, number one, with your sharing, And also with those book recommendations, as I always like to say for folks, we have interesting conversations. We want folks to get a deliverable who are listening to the podcast. And there's no better way than to hear two folk have a conversation at the virtual bar, so to speak, and then be able to go to the library, Amazon, or the used bookstore. I'm always a big fan of used bookstores, and then further their own learning. So I really want to thank you for those recommendations and for your time.
Well, you too, Chauncey. And when you're follow in the footsteps of Oprah or other great Chicago talk show hosts, and have your national network TV, maybe we can come and talk some more.
Well, you may very well be there far, far sooner than I, and I will be emailing you, because Oprah would have happened by now, unless I can find her walking down the street and throw myself at her feet. I did see George Lucas the other day walking down the street, and I had to resist. I saw him at the movie theater, and he was with his wife in plain sight just walking around, and I had to resist the urge to yell at him. But I did sort of smile, and he gave me the wink and the nod of his head, so that was good enough for me. But once you make it big, I will be emailing you for sure. But thank you for the kind energy and the good words. I want to thank Bob Neer one more time. Great conversation, great sharing. And so the technical details are very fascinating too in terms of research and writing. And sometimes the most interesting puzzles are sitting right in front of you and they're unsolved. Because either people didn't think it was interesting or they never thought to ask the question that way. So Bob Neer's An American Biography on Napalm. Good book. And I'm so appreciative of him taking the time to sit down and chat with us. I'm sitting here confessing again my sins. Of course, I got my high fructose corn syrup beverage. I got the Coca-Cola in a can and I backslid. I said I wouldn't. I said I'd stop. But you can't make someone well if they're sick. And I'm very sick with the Coca-Cola. And I'm going to share a story as a transition to my final segment as we give you a little preview of who's going to be next week. But I always like to share little personal details with friends. You guys give me so much advice online, lots of wisdom and love. Please send it to chaunceyDeVega@gmail.com. And for folks who are educators, teachers, folks who work in a capacity where they have to mentor or train others, maybe you've had an experience like this. But I talked about this experience with two of our upcoming guests because I wanted to get their perspectives on it. But I want to hear what you guys have to say. So as folks know, I'm a college lecturer of some capacity, doing my job, trying to do my 9 to 5. Enjoy talking to young folk, learn a lot, talking to folks. We have a lot of older students now coming back after the military as well, learning a lot from them and their life experiences. And I believe the classroom should be a seminar. Those are the sort of courses that I enjoyed in college, sort of things that I learned from. So I believe in conversation and going back and forth and exchanging ideas in an honest and respectful way and letting those moments develop organically. As I tell my students, do your reading ahead of time because there's no guarantee I'm going to sit here and lecture to you and summarize things you should have read. Now, for some students who are independent, who enjoy that style of learning, who don't think that the college classroom should be a passive place where you just sit there and somebody puts slides up on the screen, what I affectionately call PowerPoint karaoke, they find that invigorating. Now, there's some students, and this is what my story is about, who don't want to work, who don't want to be challenged, who want to have their life experiences and priors validated as opposed to having creative and productive moments of what we like to call ideological disruption, those interventions. I've been teaching for a few years. I've had some interesting experience. I've had students around the classroom crying, no lie, because I told them the truth about the myths that they are attached to about the civil rights movement, that Sister Rosa Parks was a tired old lady whose feet were hurting, so she sat down on a bus and refused to get up. That, she's actually part of a planned resistance, and black folks, we have agency, and the long civil rights movement. I actually had a young woman cuss me out almost, without using profanity, cry and storm out of the classroom. I've had, like I'm sure a lot of folks who talk about issues of race, power, identity, politics, culture, just the mean eyeballs when you're shattering their sacred truths, the lies they've internalized about American history, culture, their own life chances. But I've never had a student give me so much pause that I was actually afraid that violence, an act of violence, was going to be committed in the classroom. So we were talking about the plutocrats, the 1%, and consumerism. I made a very basic observation. I said that your self-worth as a human being is not determined by your ability to buy things, by your ability to participate in a consumerist project. Moreover, we are learning empirically that the 1%, the plutocrats, those folk who are in the top 5%, top 10%, the top of the pyramid, their behavior tends to be unethical and immoral. And we have a lot of tests about this, about their capacity to cheat, their capacity to lie, their capacity to break the rules in a self-serving way and then deny that they've broken the rules. A lot of psychologists doing some great work on that. So I guess that's just a toxic mix for some people, especially for some students who are the money classes, who are not self-aware, who are participating in a consumerist project where they think that because they can buy some expensive telephone they don't need and some overpriced jeans, that they are better than other people. So I had a student quite literally look at me like he's going to kill me. And I've been in some scuffles Folks know that about Chauncey DeVega, working class black man, walking these mean streets. I've had to introduce some folks to Jack and Johnson. That's what we call them. That's a joke for folks who are Will Ferrell fans. Jack Johnson. That's my left and my right. And of course, my stories about my epic street combat will exaggerate over time so that by the time, if I live to be 100 and I can still take care of myself and not go to the bathroom with myself and be independent, because I won't live to be 100 be a burden on anybody. My epic exploits will make me sound like Conan the Barbarian, made it up with Chuck Norris or something, with some of The Rock thrown in too. But being real, I don't know what's going on in our culture. Maybe it's the culture of cruelty. Maybe it's desires that have been so sharpened in a generation that doesn't believe in the idea of the commons and the common good. And they know on a certain level the world is screwed and all they have is their capacity to buy things. And when you expose the hollowness of consumerism as a barometer for self-worth and the worth of others, maybe they just can't handle it. So this young man looked at me about to kill me. He got up, rushed up to the front of the classroom, made some demands about something we were doing in class, and just the rage. And for a moment there, I'm being real, dropping the mask for a second. I was like, dude, this is going to hit me. I'm going to have to cover up. And then do I hit him back and get in trouble? Self-defense is self-defense, but in the university, you don't have a lot of power in that regard. And I said, God forbid, what if this crazy man starts shooting people? I mean, the rage was that real. So folks, send a brother some wisdom or advice about what you would have done in that situation. Are you a teacher or educator, somebody in the workplace where you've had to deal with those sort of toxic moments? I think I handled it well, but even the students in the classroom turned around and were like, oh my God, what the hell is about to go down now? So that's just some love out there to folks who think teaching in any capacity, especially I don't even want to think about what these middle school and high school and elementary school teachers are going through. If this sort of bad behavior and rage and meanness is happening on the college level, my God, I don't want to think about what's going on in our other types of learning institutions. I really don't. So I just had to process that with you guys because you all mean a lot to me and I enjoy our talking and our sharing and our going back and forth here on ChaunceyDeVega.com. My various other places I contribute, Salon and Alternate, who've been showing me a lot of love lately, and of course the podcast known as the Chauncey DeVega Show. So one of the tasks that I enjoy, that I don't enjoy it, I actually hate it. I'm sure folks in the world of work have had to do these, and I try to do it whenever we do the fundraiser, is a moment of critical self-reflection, where you have to do that horrible annual review, where they ask you some questions that you're struggling to answer because the questions are so banal. How would you rate your performance last year? What areas would you like to improve? Are there any new challenges or opportunities you would like to discuss? Overall, rate your relationship with your boss or your manager. Is there anything you would like human resources to know? We've all had to go through this stuff, and you're struggling to find something to be critical of yourself to show some growth, but also trying to build yourself up so you can get that raise. So the New York Times had a really nice short piece. I'm going to read some of it to you because I like to do my reading moment, but I think this is very useful for all of us, especially those of us who are trying to improve the craft of our writing, those of us who are involved in any sort of venture where we are communicating with other people. And I want to give some love out to some of the friends and supporters of We Are Respectable Negroes. I'm using that name again, Warren, as we like to call it, and ChaunceyDeVega.com, who have started their own blogs, started their own projects. I'm so excited to see the smart and interesting people we have who are friends of the website doing their own thing, because there's room for everybody. And as blogging has its ebbs and flows, we know this, as online journalism has its ebbs and flows, it's increasingly important that as the chaff falls, I guess, from a tree, does chaff fall from a tree? It fills the sky. That as the weak fall, that the strong survive. And that's going to create some opportunities for folk who are doing good work, because there's a lot of hot garbage out there, just like in many other endeavors. And it's good to see good, smart, interesting people stepping up. So, great piece, New York Times, basically journalist talking about all the things that she's learned and advice to new journalists. And it's about 25 points. I'm not going to read all of them, but I'm going to go through them pretty quickly because this is my moment of critical self-evaluation. I'm doing it early for the podcast because next month is fundraising month, of course. We'll be talking about that as the time arrives. And of course, if you like and support, find what we do here on the podcast known as the Chauncey DeVega Show of value, you can go to ChaunceyDeVega.com. Right-hand sidebar, there's a little thing that says PayPal. Throw a penny or $2 or $5 or $100 or whatever you can manage into that PayPal bucket. That helps me a lot. The show takes time. It takes energy, opportunity costs, several hours between the interviews and the production to get this out there for you. It's a labor of love, but any kindness and support is always welcome. So from the New York Times. So I think this is just some good advice, I think, in general for life. So about journalism. First bit of advice. Don't cut corners. Do the actual work. I think I'm doing okay on that. And again, if folks agree or disagree, send me an email. I think I got a lot of hyperlinks. I try to show my work. I think that's one of the things I really try to do well. I'm going to show you what I'm about to do to you before I do it. So I try to be really transparent. It's not a magic trick. Show your work. And I think that I'm doing pretty well on that. Here's an important one. If you borrow, always credit with a link and a specific mention and always write in your own words. Well, I'd certainly try to do that. So I give myself some points on that one. And no, this is not an act of narcissism and self-congratulation. There's some stuff on this list I got to work on. You can lose your reputation and your career in an instant. Well, folks need to take that advice because that's absolutely true. And that's one of the things you got to struggle with, especially with social media and Twitter. Folk will find things, take it out of context, and try to wallop you upside the head with it. But you can't work defensively. You got to own your words. But that's something I've been thinking more and more about because you have to balance the persona and the person you are, because I'm just me with the volume turned up, with how others may or may not perceive it in an environment where your enemies, in this case, the right-wing mouth-breathing troglodytes and others, don't proceed from a premise of intellectual honesty. They are fully propagandized. They are dishonest people. And so many folk who are reasonable conservatives, because they hate them too, centrists, progressives, liberals, and pragmatists like myself, they're not proceeding. The radical right, the white right, the movement conservative, and they're so propagandized, you can't even deal with these people. So you don't want to be defensive because you're dealing with madness, because once you start to cede any sort of point to them, you're already lost. And they're following up. Despite that, don't be timid. Be brave. Just don't be brave and stupid. Now, that's some good life advice in general. Don't be brave and stupid. I'm going to put that one on the top of the mental Rolodex. I think I do good on this one. Ask for advice from smart people. Yeah, I think I'm working on that one. I'm going to start asking for more advice because some of my life's derailments, ups and downs have been caused by not following through on the advice I've gotten from smart people. And that's something I'm really trying to remedy as I approach 4 decades. You really got to listen. Don't ask for the advice from smart people if you're not going to listen to it. Certainly, I got to work on that one a wee bit more. Do the work that improves the world even in a small way. Okay, I'm not that grandiose. I'd like to think that my work does a little good. And you can tell me, does it? You guys tell me if the work is improving the world in even a small way. Don't seek to least common denominator journalism. Well, I think I give myself a A- on that one. Like George Costanza's father in Seinfeld. That's a double Seinfeld reference. I try not to follow the trends. I may walk the racism beat, but there's a lot of triviality and BS I have no interest in commenting on. And just because other folk are talking about it, I ain't going to mention it. So I think I'm doing okay. I think this is one I'm doing really good on. See, I can't imagine my boss is reading my personal evaluations. A little snark goes a long way. Well, I think I got a little wit and some snark. So I think I'm doing good on that. Think more about fairness than objectivity. I'm not a journalist. And I don't maintain a pretense of fairness. I have a point of view, I have an argument, and I have an agenda. Period. So I'm not a who, what, where, when, how, and why sort of guy. My work here is about advocacy, truth-telling, and I can do that without being fair or objective. My objectivity is the truth. I wear that one on my sleeve. Think about how close you can get to the truth. That's one right there we should all be thinking about. Nuance. How close can you get to the truth? So that's some very good advice. Skipping around here. Put yourself in the place of the people who will be affected by your work. That doesn't mean to pull your punches. Well, I don't know about that one. I'm being real. I have no empathy for dealing with folks who stand against the common good, who do the work of the neoliberal plutocrats, who do the work of white supremacy, white racism, and white privilege. I show them no mercy because they show us no mercy. They show all people of conscience who want to make the world a better place no mercy. Why show mercy on them? Everybody has to reconcile and answer that one for themselves. Can't give you advice on that one, but that's where I stand on that one. Be rigorous. Go the extra mile. If you think you should interview 5 people, interview 10. Fact check with a vengeance. I think I'm doing okay with that. To work harder always with your facts, and I've been extra careful in terms of as my platform has grown and other people are running my stuff, making sure trying to use the best and most rigorous sources possible. But you can always get better with that one. Here's advice for journalists. Be aggressive. A passive journalist isn't really a journalist. I'm not a journalist, but that certainly seems to make good sense. We need more folks walking that beat doing real journalism, that's for sure. Get to be really good at 1 or 2 things and get to be decently good at a whole bunch of things. Jack of all trades, master of none, but I think there's something to be said for having more than one skill set. But that's the trick. You get an audience and they expect you to do the same thing all the time. Walk the racism beat, walk the gender beat. Just talk about international relations. Just talk about American politics from a certain point of view. And then when you swerve your reader, not just to trick them, but because the world isn't that simple and you have more than one interest, that makes it hard to market yourself. So that's something for all you folk who are thinking about getting into this blogging thing or online writing or professional writing. Building a brand. I hate that phrase. How do you keep the people you got and bring them with you while doing something different that's true to you? because it's real tedious to keep writing the same stuff over and over and over and over and over again. Trust me on that. But what if the struggle needs to be repeated? So that's something to certainly think about. If you screw up, apologize fully and move on. Well, I think that's just good life advice. It's hard for some to do that. There's some people in this world who will never tell you they're sorry. And maybe a few years ago when I was encountering some folk like this, you do your own personal list of your own shortcomings, because God knows I got them. You would think that's the sort of type of strength. And very often people who seem strong because they're not willing to own their bad behavior or say I'm sorry because they're afraid, they're really very weak people. There's some people I've met who say, I don't know how to say I'm sorry. I don't know how to say I'm wrong. And you step back and be like, man, you're really weak. There's a lot of strength from owning one's bad behavior. Or they structure the bar for their bad behavior so damn high it's impossible to reach, and they pull a swerve on you. We're like, of course I apologize when I should apologize, but they never apologize. I think we all got people like that in our lives, and I think folks like that need to be especially self-critical about their own weakness and what they're afraid of. Try to work for somebody great. That's a good one. But how much choice do we have about that? I guess that's about aiming high. Aiming high. Not being afraid to go that extra mile and say, instead of getting the second tier school, I'm going to aim for the top tier school. When I have a great boss, what can I learn from him? I think that's good advice. Whatever help you've received in your career, pay it forward. Well, that's a good one. Always give it back. Be idealistic. Resist cynicism. That's good advice. Certainly easier in some endeavors in life than the others, but be idealistic. And how do folks do that? I mean, is it just drawing strength from the good energy around you, from the people who've done the right thing, not the wrong thing, from the opportunities you've been given? Trying to look at the bright side of life instead of the down or hazy side of life? But that's something to meditate on. And I think this is the money shot, to borrow that phrase. Never be boring. Be engaging and clear, especially when the subject is complicated or hard to understand. If you're writing blurry stuff, maybe you don't understand the subject yet. Pity the readers or viewers and consider their attention span. That's great advice. And it's hard because you don't want to just be an entertainer, but if folk are bored in any capacity, and that boring doesn't necessarily mean, you're writing dry stuff that's technical. That can be interesting in its own way. But if you're writing something and doing something you wouldn't want to read, well, why would anybody else want to read it? And I think that gets down to presentation and style. So that's something I'm always working on. And I think sometimes I try to be a little too entertaining and witty and pithy with my witty. And I don't want to dial it down, but I'm always trying to develop new skills. I never want anybody to take what I say too lightly, but I have different voices and working on that. And here's the big question, especially for journalism. You're not in this business for the money, so what are you in it for? Do that work. And I think if you're a journalist, as I said, I'm an essayist, teacher, lecturer, media personality. Is that what my business card I just ordered says? Somebody advised me to say media personality. I don't know what the hell that means. Just so they can reach out and give me money to run my mouth. Because again, that's another little surprise that's working out. Be giving folks some insight on that. Documentary project. And some other things that seem to be bubbling up, thanks to all of you. So that's from the New York Times, advice about writing and journalism. See, you get the entertainment, you get the substance, you get the nutrients. It's a balanced meal. And that's all I'm trying to give you here on the Chauncey DeVega Show is a balanced meal. So next week's installment of the podcast known as the Chauncey DeVega Show features Dr. David Krugler. He's the author of a great new book called 1919, The Year of Racial Violence. Now, this is a great book about that bloody red summer where you had white racial pogroms and black resistance all over this country after World War I, where you had white racist pogroms like Chicago, like East St. Louis, Washington, D.C., all over this country, Florida, Texas, I believe in Ohio, Indiana, all over this country. You had white racist violence against black people. Tulsa, the honored dead in Tulsa. Black Wall Street. And Dr. Krugler's book is really good because he talks about resistance. He talks about the many ways that black and brown folks stood up against white supremacy, because you get the victim story, right? Oh, these white rampaging mobs burned down black communities in Chicago and lynched black folks by the hundreds, if not the thousands. They bombed Tulsa and used machine guns on fleeing Negroes. See, that's my 19-teens radio voice, my yellow journalism voice. But you don't hear about the black men and women and these black American World War I vets manning bunkers, going to the armory, getting their own weapons, making Molotov cocktails, protecting their communities, fighting back. You don't hear that story. And we're going to talk about why that is. Is it a function of America's misremembering of its own past? Is it a black elite that wants to craft a story that doesn't emphasize black resistance for the purposes of creating a narrative of victimhood in the service of righteous struggle? Is it just some of these events were not recorded? These brave people, their stories long gone, except as oral histories? And you have to go to archives and wonderful resources like the Schomburg, or talk to your grandparents if you have them still in your life, and your great-grandparents if they're still in your life, about this narrative. And I remember as a teenager discovering these stories of black resistance, because we talked about this in season 1 and 2 of the podcast with some of our great guests. I didn't grow up being told that black people were passive, that we were victims, that all of a sudden the civil rights movement happened in the 1960s and black people were free. We always fought back because we're human beings, and human beings resist. They resist domination. They resist oppression. They resist the boot on their neck. I don't care if there are Jewish brothers in a ghetto in Poland fighting back, or if they're black and brown folk in the streets of Baltimore and Ferguson, or if there are First Nations brothers and sisters fighting back against the hell that was unleashed on them. People resist. That's a human story. So, Brother Krugler, Dr. Krugler, great book. And that's going to be the subject for our next installment of the Chauncey DeVega Show. And as always, here's my standard closer, folks. You already got my little fundraising pitch. So if you can, throw some ducats into that pile, if you can, next month, all month long, but I try to cut off the fundraiser once we reach our arbitrary amount that I've set. That'll be next month. That'll be the month of June. We do that twice a year because we don't advertise here. I just had another offer to advertise and do paid for content. Decent amount of money. I was like, nope, sorry. That's not what we're doing here on the Chauncey DeVega Show or on the website, chaunceyvega.com. So please, if you can show some love and you appreciate what we're doing, please throw them ducats in either this week, next week, or next month. And as I always say, please leave the world a better place than you found it every day. Be nice to a stranger. Take care of our four-legged, winged, and reptilian friends. Call up someone you haven't talked to. Reach out to a loved one and give them a hug. And sometimes, as I give folk updates. So as always, be safe, especially in these trying times. We got trains, tornadoes, bad weather. Please be safe. And especially if you can, look out for our homeless brothers and sisters. They need our love. They need our love. I don't care if it's giving somebody a sandwich. I don't care if it's giving somebody $1. Because it could be you. It could be me. So we got to try to be good to each other. So until next week, great guest, as I said, Professor David Krugler, talking about African-American resistance and Bloody Red Summer 1919, both before and after. It wasn't just 1 year. That's a great conversation, let me tell you. That is a great conversation, folks. Next week, here on the epononymously named podcast with interesting people, doing interesting and smart things, making witty and smart, pithy witty about matters of public concern. Until next week, I want to thank you again for listening to, sharing, and downloading the epononymously named podcast known as The Chauncey DeVega Show.